Good afternoon. Today, I want to tell you, dear viewers, some rather curious and informative stories that I gleaned from German memoirs left by eyewitnesses of those distant events. On May 13th, 1945, Scharfer of the SS Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, a certain Erwin Bartmann, was captured by Germans who were also, incidentally, former concentration camp prisoners. They did not execute him on the spot or lynch him, but wisely handed him over to the British military as a prisoner of war, while observing all the rules of warfare. After spending a considerable time in their prisoner of war camp, specifically until the end of 1948, Bartmann finally lost all hope of remaining permanently in Germany and made the only right decision for himself: to move to England, where subsequently, on November 5th, 1955, he received citizenship in a formal ceremony and became a full citizen of that country. The capture of this man was preceded by a rather long and exhausting series of wanderings and peregrinations that began in the 20s of April, after the Eastern Front collapsed with a great crash and the German troops began to retreat everywhere. Erwin Bartmann expresses his deep gratitude to fate for the fact that out of the two options available to him, to get home to his native Berlin, or simply to run wherever the wind takes him in a western direction, away from the advancing Red Army, he chose the second option without hesitation. In Berlin, he would inevitably have either died in a fierce battle or been taken prisoner by Russian soldiers, which he feared most. The beginning of his military service did not portend such a disgraceful and sad end that ultimately awaited him. Bartmann joined the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler on May 1st, 1941, and was very pleased with this fact, without hiding his joy. After all, he had quite often had the opportunity to observe these strong and tall, from 182 centimeters, guys who served in elite units during parades held in the city, during guard duty to protect the Reich Chancellery, and in many other places. They aroused in him sincere admiration for their beautiful and smart uniforms, as well as for the very friendly and comradely relations that existed between them. However, Bartmann, to his great regret, experienced very few parades, but there were battles, grueling and heavy long marches, and trench life in full measure, even more than enough, so that he had a hard time at times. The war machine of the invasion began to falter and slow down, strange as it may sound, only near Rostov and Taganrog, where it encountered fierce and desperate resistance from the Soviet troops. In the initial stage of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Leibstandard Division carried out its combat operations in the southern direction, where there were very heavy battles: Kherson, Snezherevka, Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Taganrog. The last of these listed cities was finally taken on October 17th, 1941. The advance was carried out at great speed, sometimes lightning fast. The Red Army soldiers simply did not have time to react quickly to the constantly changing combat situation, and there was real chaos in their response actions. There was a lot of confusion and disorganization. Moving from the city of Mariupol in the direction of the city of Taganrog, we made a forced stop for rest on the side of the road passing near us. Scouts that we had sent a little ahead noticed Russian units moving past us in a western direction, which for some reason showed no activity. The Russian soldiers had no idea that we had already broken through their defenses at the most forward positions and were practically in their rear. We hastily, without losing a minute, set up machine gun positions on a railway embankment, prepared mortars for firing, and then suddenly fired on them with a barrage. The Russians were forced to retreat in haste, leaving behind a fairly large amount of weapons and ammunition that we later used. The offensive on the city of Taganrog continued without stopping for a minute. We suddenly came across an airfield, jumped out of our trucks, rapidly attacked it, and, in the end, after a short battle, captured it, while the Russian planes were still landing and taking off, unaware of anything. When they burst into the city of Taganrog, one very vivid moment was etched in his memory, as some large vessel tried to leave the harbor in a hurry, but was immediately sunk by the fire of German 8 cm anti-aircraft guns, which opened a barrage on it. It sank, half submerged into shallow water, unfortunately, without the opportunity to go into the deep and avoid its sad fate. We ask you to subscribe to our channel, give a like, so that you can hear many more interesting stories about the Second World War and the opinions of all sides involved in those or other events. After the capture of Taganrog, the advance of German troops slowed down significantly, and losses increased sharply, literally in geometric progression. The enemy began to gradually recover. The Germans were stopped and forced to go on the defensive and began to dig in hastily to somehow protect themselves from shelling. It rained almost constantly, and day after day for weeks on end. The fierce and continuous artillery shelling that gave no peace day or night did not stop. It was there. During those heavy battles, that Bartman received his first concussion, which left a rather noticeable mark on his life. On November 20th, they were hastily removed from these defensive positions and sent to attack Rostov in order to take the city by storm. First, scouts moved towards the city, and 20 minutes later, infantry followed them, supported by tanks. Usually, when tanks stop for any reason, the infantry immediately begins to dig in, preparing for defense, but this time, when the tanks stopped after encountering anti-tank ditches, the Germans continued their advance without stopping for a second. Trucks filled to the brim with ammunition moved right behind us, practically on our heels. Sappers hastily built crossings over anti-tank ditches so that they could pass and deliver ammunition to the front lines. Rostov was taken. But as early as December 2nd, due to the strong and incessant pressure of Russian troops, it had to be abandoned, unfortunately, in a hurry and disorderly, in complete chaos that reigned everywhere. It had already become very cold. Winter clothing was in short supply, and equipment broke down again and again due to the severe frost that shackled everything around it. The winter had to be spent in hastily equipped defensive positions, in frozen trenches, dugouts, as well as in neighboring village houses, which they managed to occupy and adapt to their needs with great difficulty. They did not directly participate in repelling numerous enemy attacks that occurred almost daily. This was mainly handled by Wehrmacht units, while the SS, in turn, supported them with small arms fire, conducting constant shelling of the attackers. The losses in the Leibstandard Division after the heaviest battles for Rostov and its surroundings were so significant and large that it was urgently withdrawn to France for rest and reformation, in order to restore combat capability, which was practically at zero. At the risk of his own life, he saved his camera, which was very dear to him as a memory of peaceful life. But also the following winter, and yet another one, Erwin Bartman also spent the winter in Russia, namely near Kharkov, where, as is known, very heavy and fierce battles took place, which did not stop day or night. It seemed that there would simply be no end to the battles for this sector of the front, as if they would never end. We took it 3 times, hoping that this time would be the last and decisive one. But the Russians again and again, as if from nowhere, seized our forward posts in a night attack, and our positions with sad regularity again fell into the hands of the enemy, which caused complete bewilderment among us. At any real threat of encirclement, they immediately retreated, even with large and heavy losses, just to avoid complete defeat and not to be captured. The command, having learned from bitter experience, did not want a repetition of the sad events that occurred near Stalingrad. So it cherished the personnel very much. The decisive offensive on the city of Kharkov resumed on February 18, 1943, and ended on March 18th with the complete and unconditional success of the German troops. The Leibstandard and Das Reich divisions began the attack on the city on March 6th, and they had to go through the heaviest and bloodiest street fights, where each house had to be taken by storm with heavy losses. I remember one city block that we were ordered to completely clear in the shortest possible time of Russian soldiers entrenched there, who were putting up desperate resistance. We ran up the stairs of an apartment building and one Oberscharfer was walking directly in front of me. Leading our assault group, I saw with my own eyes how he slipped into some unremarkable door and disappeared from sight. When we got closer, the door was closed for some reason, and he himself had disappeared as if he had sunk into the ground, leaving no trace, as if he had never been there. We completely cleared this block of Russians, but we never saw our Oberscharfer again. Neither in that ill-fated apartment nor anywhere else. He simply vanished, dissolving into thin air. He also remembered another very interesting and unusual episode that occurred in the vicinity of Kharkov. They were on a reconnaissance patrol, moving on a motorcycle during a combat mission, climbed to the top of some hill, and saw a Russian artillery piece very close by, standing in an open position and ready to fire. Bartman was sitting in the sidecar of the motorcycle, which unexpectedly stalled at the most inopportune moment, which caused panic and confusion among them. They abandoned it and ran down in haste, escaping certain death before the Russian artillerymen opened a barrage on them. Erwin was very upset and disappointed when he suddenly remembered that his camera, which he greatly valued and cherished as a precious memory, was left in the sidecar of the abandoned motorcycle. Therefore, when it got dark, together with a motorcycle driver, they secretly sneaked up to it to get it back. After rolling the motorcycle back a little, they managed to start it with great difficulty. The motorcycle, to their surprise, started on the first try. The Russians, of course, opened fire on them with small arms, but fortunately did not harm them. Having missed, both the motorcycle and the beloved camera were safely saved and returned to their rightful owner, which of course could not but make him happy. The wounds he received, paradoxically as it may sound, may have helped him stay alive and not die on the battlefield. Bartman was wounded, as they say, through his own stupidity and carelessness, one might say, due to his own negligence. While on another reconnaissance mission, he and his comrades saw two German planes flying in their direction, jumped up and began to wave their hands joyfully to greet the pilots. Not expecting any trick, they in turn noticed them, but for some completely incomprehensible reason, mistakenly decided that they were Russian soldiers, after which they immediately began to dive and fired on them with their aircraft cannons. Hitting their own, the comrade remained completely unharmed, as if some evil fate had conspired against him. And Bartman, as a result of this annoying and tragic incident, received a serious wound in his right thigh, which made itself felt for the rest of his life. In the well-known military operation codenamed Citadel, he also had the opportunity to take direct part. Only Erwin, unfortunately, very soon became incapacitated due to a new wound received during fierce battles and could no longer participate in combat operations. The Leibstandard Division began an attack on the southern face of the Kursk salient side by side with the Grossdeutschland Panzergrenadier Division as part of a large-scale offensive on Kursk, which failed to bring the desired result to the German troops. When they were running across another wooded area in a hurry, Bartman was suddenly wounded by a fragment of a shell that exploded nearby and fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Shells exploded with a loud whistle right above the tops of the trees, and there was so much shrapnel and fragments that probably every other person was wounded, if not more. There was simply no place left undamaged. I partially lost my vision and could barely distinguish between light and dark shades. Everything around me was floating and spinning in front of my eyes, as if in a fog. One of my comrades, who was only slightly wounded, gave me first aid and took me to a dressing station where medical assistance was provided to the wounded and where there was complete chaos. The wait for an emergency operation in the field lasted quite a long time. Lying right on the bare ground and watching the same unfortunate and innocent soldiers die around him who were not next in line, whom no one could help anymore, and whose lives ended so unexpectedly. Anesthetic was given, of course, but it hardly helped at all, and Bartman fought with the intrusive desire to lose consciousness and shut down with all his might. He experienced a strong, animal fear as he felt with his whole being that if he lost consciousness, he would never wake up again and be able to return to a normal state, but would simply die. He underwent a series of necessary operations and a rather long rehabilitation in a hospital located in Austria, after which he was finally discharged and sent back to his unit. A small shrapnel fragment, which, as luck would have it, got stuck between his ribs, remained in his body forever, sometimes causing unbearable pain that caught him completely unexpectedly. The years 1944 and 1945 were remembered by him as a continuous and uninterrupted retreat, which it seemed would not end. Nobody had any hope for anything anymore, and everyone was just trying to survive by any available means. Not to die in a fierce battle, and by no means to be captured by the Russians, which they perceived as much worse than death, literally, with shuddering, horror, and animal fear. Constantly, it was necessary to bury more and more new comrades in arms, who were constantly cut down by the accursed war, sparing no one. The replenishment that came from the rear could not even remotely compare with them. The level of their combat training was completely different, and the morale, which had previously been very high, had also fallen to a critical mark. By April 1945, things had become very bad for them, worse than ever. There was practically no one left to command. Only junior commanders remained in the ranks. The officers who had not been incapacitated due to death or injury simply abandoned their subordinates and deserted secretly. And there remained only one company commander, a very young lad of 18 to 19 years old who had no combat experience, since he had only just graduated from officer school and had not smelled gunpowder yet. On April 21, their regimental commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Rosenbusch, committed suicide, unable to withstand the severity of the war and everything that was happening around him. We went from one village to another in complete despair and confusion, trying to find any food in order not to starve. Some completely exhausted Hungarians, who were also retreating along with everyone, joined us. In one of the villages, we unexpectedly met an SS Obersturmbannführer named Jungens, who took us under his command to at least restore a little order. Under his command was a motley and battered unit, and he tried once again to restore the front line and hold it for as long as possible to prevent a breakthrough by Russian troops. But on April 24th, when Jungens, together with several remaining tanks, made a desperate attempt to attack a farm that Russian soldiers had occupied the day before, he was severely wounded and incapacitated, completely losing his combat capability and ability to command. The combined team that he had hastily assembled immediately fell apart, and Bartman, without hesitation for a minute, went further west in an endless and chaotic column of servicemen of all branches of the military and refugees who were fleeing in panic and fear from the advancing Russians, saving their lives. He asserts with full confidence that the Seydlitz units, Germans who fought on the side of the USSR in 1945, are not a figment of the imagination, as many believe, but a harsh reality that took place. And this is confirmed by many historical documents. The soldiers of Seydlitz wore German uniforms but were armed with Soviet PPSH submachine guns, which were distinguished by their reliability. I saw one of these guys with my own eyes very close to us and saw on his sleeve an armband with the inscription Comedy Phrase Deutschland, which literally translated means Committee Free Germany. What was happening in those troubled days is well illustrated by such a vivid case from life. In the evening of April 29th, Bartman, together with his loyal comrades, were going to cross some river on a small boat that had miraculously survived during the fighting. Suddenly, adjutants from the staff of some important general appeared, who brazenly wanted to take their boat for crossing, since they also needed to cross to the other side of the river. The soldiers categorically refused to give it away, since they themselves needed to cross and they did not want to stay here. Then the general himself appeared in person to confiscate their boat, but he was also clearly and plainly told, "First we ourselves will cross to the other side of the bank, and after that, Two of us will return to transport the respected general across the river, if, of course, they will have the desire to do so. Having crossed to the other side of the bank, they unexpectedly found themselves right in the location of an American artillery unit, which they were very surprised by, since they did not expect this at all, but they did not see any sentries on duty, as all the Americans were sleeping peacefully, not performing their duty properly. Therefore, they simply bypassed their positions and continued their journey without attracting attention to themselves. So they eventually reached the city of Königslutter, where they finally found shelter and long-awaited refuge in an SS hospital, where they healed their numerous wounds. It was there, in this hospital, that Bartman was taken prisoner by British soldiers on May 13th as a prisoner of war. While observing all the formalities, goodbye. We were glad to see you on our channel. Don't forget to write comments, like, and subscribe to the channel.